Okay, this is going to be the basic building block of existence take 2, and I'm just going to skip the introduction and get right into it. So here we have a series of individual frames. Maybe we can describe them as the smallest units on a ruler or something. But so technically, if these frames represent the smallest units in existence, then nothing could exist in between each frame, because otherwise it would have to include even smaller units of distance in between each frame. But that's impossible if these frames are already the smallest units of distance in existence. So absolutely nothing can exist in between these frames if these frames are considered to be the smallest things in the universe. So what does that mean? If nothing can exist in between these frames, then what is separating these frames from each other? Is it non-existence? Well, then it would look like this. So yeah, well, it has to be non-existence because if something could exist in between the smallest frames, it would have to be smaller than the smallest frames. But that would be impossible. But on the other hand, how can non-existence separate existing things? Non-existence doesn't exist, so something which doesn't exist cannot separate existing things. So what would happen is the smallest individual frames would instantaneously smack together as tight as possible. They would be glued together with infinite force because it's fundamentally impossible for these frames or pixels or elementary units or whatever to be separated by non-existence. In other words, these elementary units would collapse into each other into a singularity. Now, the smallest elementary units of existence could not possibly be made out of smaller units because they are already the smallest units. So the question is, how big are these smallest units? If these units have a certain size with a certain thickness and volume, but if they also could not possibly be made out of smaller units, then what are they made out of? It would be impossible to perform anatomy on that unit since it would be impossible to dissect it into smaller parts. So it would be impossible to look at it from the inside of the unit. In fact, the inside of the unit as such is also impossible. It couldn't possibly have an inside because the inside would have to be smaller than the totality of the unit. So there is a logical problem. In order for something to exist physically, it must manifest itself in space and time. It should have a certain volume with a certain length, a certain height, and a certain width. Whatever it is, a particle, a substance, it must occupy a certain amount of space within 3 dimensions. So it must have a certain amount of volume. That seems to be required for anything at all to be able to exist as a physical thing. But from the moment a thing has a volume, it contains an inside part. Every thing contains an inside part, namely the volume itself within that thing. The volume itself takes in some space, so it has a certain size. So you would think that it would be possible to measure that size, but if you want to measure the size, you would need smaller measurement units than the thing itself, which is already the smallest unit itself. And that's of course not going to be possible. So the problem is that as soon as something exists that is considered to be the smallest units in existence, it already occupies a certain amount of space. You get it? A certain amount of space. But how many amounts of space? If it contains an amount of space, then these amounts would have to be smaller than the smallest unit. Well, maybe it's just one amount of space. But what is one amount of space? Is space itself made out of space particles? But then again, do these space particles have a certain size? That's the problem. If the smallest particle in existence has a certain size with a certain volume, then the amount of volume would have to be smaller than the smallest particle itself. And so that would contradict the fact that it is the smallest thing. So it seems like theoretically the smallest thing can't have a certain size. It really must be infinitely small, and even then, it doesn't matter how small it is. If it exists, it occupies a certain amount of space or a certain amount of something. So in fact, the smallest thing cannot exist, because otherwise it would contradict the fact that it is the smallest thing. But there is still something else. So, if there is such a thing as the smallest particle, then it would be impossible to divide this particle any further. Even if we used an infinite amount of force to try to cut this particle in half, it would still be impossible, theoretically. So again, it doesn't matter how small the particle is. If it exists, it must have a certain size, a certain volume. The inside of the particle would be fundamentally unbreakable. So this particle as a whole would be a perfect continuity. In other words, it would have field properties. Even though it only occupies a very small amount of space, the amount of space it occupies would form a perfect continuity without smaller separate individual units that could possibly make up that particle. So the biggest question is, what is the substance of that field made out of? Right now, theoretically, it can't possibly be made out of anything smaller. So is it a substance? Is it something? What the fuck is it? What is a continuity? The inside of this particle cannot be perceived, it cannot be measured, because it's the outer circumference that defines the ultimate smallest thing. And so the problem is that you cannot take a piece of the inside of this particle, because that would mean that this piece would be smaller than the outer circumference. And so the inside contradicts the fact that the circumference is defined as the smallest thing. So the smallest particle can't possibly have an inside part. It can only have the outer circumference. But if there can only be the circumference without an inside part, then the particle would have to be infinitely small. But again, it doesn't matter how small it is. If it exists in space, it will always contain an inside part, even if it is infinitely small. So my ultimate point is that there is no such thing as the smallest particle of existence. There can't be such a thing as the smallest thing possible, because a thing is defined by its circumference and the volume inside of it. I mean, every physical thing in the universe has a certain volume. It occupies a certain amount of space. It can't occupy zero amounts of space, because then it wouldn't exist. It will always occupy a certain amount of space. And the problem is that as soon the circumference occupies a certain amount of space, it will contain an inside part, which is always going to be smaller than the circumference. And that always contradicts the idea that the particle as a whole is the smallest thing in existence. So now we get rid of the idea that there exists such a thing as the smallest particle or smallest bit in existence. Alright, so does that now mean that reality is made out of smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller particles all the way to infinity? That there always exists a smaller particle forever? Let's go back to my conclusion that particles can never be separated by non-existence. If there exists the smallest particle of existence, and if that particle is an individual particle, then what is separating these smallest particles? As you can see, it actually is impossible to have individual existence particles, because if they actually were individual, they would have to be separated by something. But in this case, they would have to be separated by non-existence, because existence can only be located within those particles in this example. And of course, it's impossible for particles to be separated by something that doesn't exist. So this is another proof that existence cannot be made out of individual existence particles. And again, what would happen is, since these particles can't possibly be separated by non-existence, they would immediately fuse together with infinite force, such that a continuity of pure existence would be created, leaving no chance to be separated by non-existence, since that is fundamentally impossible. So the ultimate conclusion would be that the foundation of the universe could not possibly be made out of individual bits that are just chaotically moving around. Instead, the foundation of the universe would be an infinitely dense field, a perfect continuity that cannot be divided. This field is held together with infinite force. There is absolutely no way you can slice this field in half. You cannot divide this field into individual particles. It's an infinite continuity, which means that it has no particular location. It's everywhere at the same time. We really have to understand what a perfect continuity means. So it's an infinitely dense field without individual particles located in this field. So there is no interaction between anything whatsoever within this field. Interaction is only possible with individual particles. It's non-local. There literally is no difference between here and there for this field. There is no up or down, no above nor below, no left or right, no inside nor outside. There is no distance for this field, because distance would imply a certain amount of space. And once there is a certain amount of space, then that would imply that space is more fundamental than this field. Now maybe space itself is the field, but the problem is that once you create distance in space, let's say a certain distance between point A and B, then we have the space in between A and B, which is technically smaller and more fundamental than the field. But that's not possible because the field is the most fundamental thing. Okay, so it's impossible to put anything inside this field, not even distance. It's impossible to create a distance from A to point B in this field. The point is that everything is born out of this field, including distance. The field is more fundamental than distance or space, more fundamental than time. Yeah, it's pure continuity. How can I explain this better? A perfect continuous field is an infinite field, but it's non-local. For example, if you were to draw 2 points in this field, again, you have point A and point B, there would literally be no difference between those 2 points. They would be literally the same point. In this situation, point A equals exactly point B. They are not separated by distance. They are literally inside of each other as one thing. So the important thing to understand is, yes, it's an infinite field, but there is no distance because this field is more fundamental than measurable space. And of course that's difficult to grasp. And so every possible point on this field is literally the same point. They are not separated, even though it seems like they are separated by space and by distance. In reality they are not. Because the foundation of the universe has to be a perfect continuous field. Because there cannot exist individual quanta of space that are separated by non-existence or something. Reality has to be filled with infinitely much quanta to the point that it forms a perfect continuity. And again, in a perfect continuity, nothing is separated by anything. There are no individual things in a pure continuity. So there are also no individual units of space or units of distance or units of time. Whatever is in the field, whatever it is in the field or whenever it is in the field, it's always the exact same thing. It's timeless, it's spaceless, it's formless, it's shapeless, it's dimensionless. The field is itself and there is nothing else but itself everywhere and all the time. It never changes into something else. It doesn't transform, it doesn't interact with anything. So in this example, the red field is not continuous anymore. The red field is now made out of individual particles, which are all separated from each other. So now A and B are disconnected. The particles are now separated by space, but the particles themselves do not contain space. Because in this example, the particles are considered to be the most fundamental particles. So the inside of the particles are continuous. There is nothing within the inside of the particle that is separated by space. So there is no space on the inside of these particles, which means that there is no distance within these particles. There only exists distance within the space in which these particles are located in. And that's why A and B are separated from each other in this example. Whereas in a perfect continuous field, A and B cannot be separated because there is no space or distance inside the continuous field. So that's it basically. This is supposed to be some kind of a logical proof to prove that all of reality originates from a perfect continuous field and that nothing is essentially separated from each other. Everything is literally inside of everything else. It's all the same. There is no difference between you and me at the fundamental level. And yeah, I know that this almost sounds exactly the same as the typical spiritual talk. We are all one with the universe. Well, yeah, I don't really like this cliche spiritual talk. I prefer logic and I want to prove the absolute oneness of everything in a very logical way. Now, anyway, I'm gonna leave it right here. There's still more stuff that I have prepared, but it's gonna be way too much. And I'm just gonna I'm gonna use it for another video. Anyway, so thanks for listening if you have made it until here. Okay, bye.